August 15, 1971, a Monday night, when American families sat round their television sets expecting to hear President Richard Nixon discuss the war in Vietnam, which had consumed the nation, their attention and Treasury for years, but instead what they witnessed was something far more consequential. Decision that would quietly strip away the last anchor connecting American money to something real. Something tangible, something that had promised security for generations. Because that night Nixon didn't just make an economic policy announcement, he severed the thread that bound the entire world's financial system to physical reality, and he did it. While most Americans were focused on something else, wrapping his words in the language of national interest and patriotic necessity, when the truth was far darker and far more damaging to ordinary people who had trusted that their dollars meant something. The money in your wallet right now, the dollars that you work for, that you save, that you pass down to your children, is not worth anything real, not backed by gold or silver or any tangible asset, but backed only by a promise made by a government that has spent 53 years systematically destroying its own currency through endless money printing. That destruction started in that single August moment in 1971, when Nixon pulled the floor out from under the entire global economy, while ordinary people have been paying the price in silent, invisible ways ever since. To understand what Nixon destroyed that night, you need to understand what Bretton Woods was, because for 27 years, from 1944 to 1971, it represented something that had never existed before. In history, a global financial system built on an explicit promise of trust, where the United States, fresh from World War to victory and sitting on vast gold reserves accumulated while Europe burned, made a simple guarantee to the world that the U.S. dollar would be backed by gold at a fixed rate of $35 per ounce, meaning any nation or any foreign government could take their dollars to the U.S. Treasury and exchange them for physical gold any time, with no questions, as to making the dollar literally as good as gold, while other currencies would float round the dollar, staying within narrow bands, with the dollar itself serving as the anchor and the guarantee that held everything together. For ordinary Americans, this meant something profound. Your savings had real value. Your salary represented something tangible, because behind every dollar was supposedly a promise of gold sitting in Fort Knox. But beneath this gleaming facade something was rotting, because the problem was built into Bretton Woods from the very beginning, identified so clearly by an economist named Robert Triffin, that it became known as Triffin's dilemma, the fatal mathematical contradiction at the heart of the system, that if the U.S. dollar was going to work as the world's reserve currency, then America had to print enough dollars to satisfy global demand for international trade and reserves. But if America printed too many dollars, then eventually people would start redeeming those dollars for gold, and the U.S. didn't have enough gold to cover all the dollars it had created, making it a trap with no escape, built into the very architecture of global finance. By the mid-1960s, this trap was closing as President Lyndon Johnson fought two expensive wars simultaneously: the military campaign in Vietnam that was draining billions from the Treasury, and the domestic war on poverty through his Great Society programs, including Medicare, Medicaid, and welfare expansion, and rather than raise taxes to pay for these commitments, Johnson simply had the Federal Reserve print more money, causing inflation to creep upward, while wages stagnated and the purchasing power of the dollar began its long inexorable decline. Foreign governments noticed immediately, watching as American inflation rose, while the dollar stayed pegged to gold at $35 per ounce, and they realized with mathematical certainty that this didn't make sense, that the dollar wasn't as valuable as it used to be, that if they did exchange their dollars for gold right now, they were going to lose money, triggering a run on the dollar as foreign nations started demanding gold for their paper, with France under President Charles de Gaulle being particularly aggressive. After de Gaulle publicly called for a return to the classical gold standard in 1965, essentially calling out the American con and ordering his finance minister to convert French dollar reserves into physical gold as fast as possible, which was the beginning of the end. By 1968, the situation had become critical as U.S. Gold reserves hemorrhaged out of Fort Knox, with countries redeeming dollars for gold at an accelerating pace, so the Federal Reserve and central banks from 7 other nations created the London Gold Pool to coordinate massive gold sales whenever the market price threatened to rise above $35 per ounce, literally dumping gold into markets to maintain the fiction of stability in a desperate, expensive measure that required constantly depleting their reserves, exactly what they were trying to prevent, and by 1971 it was mathematically clear the game was over, as the U.S. had gone from holding 20,000 tons of gold in 1950 to only 8,333 tons, surrendering nearly 60% of America's gold reserves to maintain a currency peg that was designed from the start to fail. Nixon faced a choice in August 1971. He could have let the system collapse, naturally accepted that American monetary hegemony was ending, and allowed a transition to floating exchange rates with honesty and transparency. But Nixon didn't choose honesty, because Nixon never chose honesty, so instead he convened a secret meeting at Camp David in the second week of August 1971, bringing together key economic advisors including Treasury Secretary John Connally and Federal Reserve Chairman Arthur Burns, to decide how to seize the initiative and turn crisis into opportunity. Burns, representing the traditional banking establishment, wanted a gradual response, with markets adjusting slowly to cushion the blow. But Connally, a tough Texas businessman who understood power better than economics, pushed for something radical and shocking, advising Nixon to close the gold window immediately without warning, and blame it on foreign speculators and international instability, arguing with brilliant cynicism that yes, it would technically be a default on America's promise, and yes, it would damage trust in the dollar, but it would also give the U.S. total freedom to print as much money as it wanted, to devalue the dollar strategically, to make American exports cheaper and more competitive, and to allow American banks to lend without restraint, because the entire world was still dependent on the dollar regardless of whether it was backed by anything real. Nixon agreed and decided to make the announcement that Sunday night, August 15, 1971, without warning Congress, without warning foreign governments, without warning the American people, framing it as a temporary measure and a new economic policy to protect America from international money speculators, making it sound necessary, defensive, and patriotic, when it was actually the U.S. unilaterally breaking the rules of the system it had created and imposed on the world. That Sunday evening, Nixon sat in the Oval Office with cameras rolling and spoke directly to the American people with calculated deception, announcing that we must protect the dollar from the attacks of international money speculators, and proclaiming the time has come for a new economic policy. But notice what he didn't say. He didn't say we're abandoning the gold standard. He didn't say we're defaulting on our promise to redeem dollars for gold. He didn't say the system we promised you is fundamentally broken, instead talking vaguely about international speculators and bold action, making the end of Bretton Woods sound like a defensive measure against foreign attack, when in reality it was America breaking its word and defaulting on its obligations to the world. The stock market jumped for 1% the next day, and Wall Street cheered, because Wall Street understood immediately what had happened. The constraints had been removed. Banks could now create money without limit. Debt could grow without restraint. The Federal Reserve could manipulate the currency without worrying about gold backing, and the wealthy understood the game, could move their money into assets that would inflate faster than the currency depreciated. For ordinary people, the disaster unfolded slowly over decades. Inflation, that was running at about 5% in 1971, accelerated to 12% by 1973. After OPEC cut oil supplies in retaliation for American support of Israel, then hit 11% in 1974 and exploded to 13.5% by 1980, destroying American families' savings in real time, as a dollar that could buy a loaf of bread in 1971 could barely buy a quarter loaf 10 years later, with families who had saved diligently for decades finding their nest eggs worth half what they thought. While real wages, the actual purchasing power of paychecks, stagnated and then declined through the 1970s, so that workers could work full-time jobs and not afford what their parents had afforded easily. This wasn't an accident or an unfortunate side effect, but the predictable result of decoupling money from gold. Because without a gold standard there's no brake on government spending, no restraint on money creation, no anchor to reality, allowing the Federal Reserve to print money endlessly throughout the 1970s while the money supply exploded and inflation ravaged ordinary people as purchasing power even. As the wealthy who understood what was happening moved their money into real estate, stocks, commodities, and tangible assets, profiting from the very inflation that devastated workers and savers. But there's another layer to this story that most people don't know about. Because Nixon didn't just close the gold window and hope the world would keep using dollars, he engineered a replacement system. Called the petrodollar through a secret 1973 deal with Saudi Arabia, where the Saudis agreed to price all oil exclusively in U.S. dollars in exchange for American military protection, which meant that every country in the world now needed dollars to buy oil regardless of whether they trusted American monetary policy, extending American financial hegemony for another 50 years based not on gold or trust but on the simple fact that global energy was denominated in dollars, giving the U.S. the ability to print enormous quantities of dollars, secure in the knowledge that global demand would remain high because of oil demand. The consequences accumulated over 5 decades as the government ran massive deficits. The Fed kept interest rates artificially low, credit expanded endlessly. And the effects of that printing inflation, asset bubbles, wealth inequality, the hollowing out of the middle class, the destruction of manufacturing employment, the stagnation of wage growth, the collapse of purchasing power for American workers have created a world where your parents probably owned a house they paid off and had stable employment with pensions. Your grandparents almost certainly had all those things. But you're statistically more likely to rent than own. To have a 30-year mortgage on a house whose price has inflated so much that even dual-income households struggle to afford it. To have no pension because those are extinct. To face precarious gig work instead of stable jobs. And to watch as the purchasing power of the dollar has declined by roughly 85% since 1971, so that the $100 your grandparent had in 1971 is worth roughly $15. Today, this isn't because your generation is lazier or less capable than previous generations. It's because of what happened on that August night in 1971 when Nixon untethered money from reality and created a system where asset prices inflate relentlessly while wages stagnate. Where housing prices outpace wage growth by factors of 2 or 3 or 5 or 10, where stock prices become disconnected from corporate earnings. Where student debt explodes because education prices inflate as endlessly as housing. Where governments love fiat currency because they can spend without restraint. Where banks love fiat currency because they can lend without restraint. Where the wealthy love fiat currency because they can move into assets that appreciate while ordinary people who hold cash and save in dollars and expect their work to be fairly compensated get systematically destroyed. Recent archival research has revealed that Nixon and his advisors actually made the decision to close the gold window in January 1971, months before announcing it in August. Meaning the supposed crisis in May 1971 wasn't the reason for the decision, but merely the excuse. The convenient moment of international financial turbulence that Nixon strategically waited for to justify a decision that had already been made, because closing the gold window gave the U.S. total monetary freedom to run unlimited deficits, keep interest rates artificially low, helping borrowers while hurting savers, allow banks to expand credit without restraint, let Wall Street blow bubbles without limits, and enable the wealthy to use inflation to their advantage, in short, transferring wealth from savers to borrowers, from workers to asset owners, from ordinary people to financial elites. Nixon closed the gold window not because the system was failing, but because the system was working too well at restraining American power. Because the gold standard was getting in the way of American financial dominance, because closing it meant America could print money to fund wars, Banks could lend recklessly and the wealthy could accumulate assets without limit, while ordinary people paid the price in purchasing power destroyed savings, eroded wages, stagnated, and futures stolen. By a monetary system that promises nothing and delivers less. If this gave you a new perspective on how the financial system really works, hit subscribe, because history has the answers and someone needs to show you where to look.